Hi, everybody. Hi. Happy Wednesday, 2:02 Eastern Time. We're hopping on because we're talking about the Gilgo Beach murders. I don't know if you all have been reading about these murders, but it's a series of brutal murders that took place in Suffolk County on Long Island between 1996 and 2010. Hi, everybody. Oh, hi, Alexis. So we're going to be just giving a review of what happened. And let me just go to Alexis. Hi, Alexis.
Hi, Katie.
Thank you so much for doing this. I thought people might be interested in learning a little more about these Gilgo Beach murders and the fact that you've been covering this story for years. Someone just said they grew up in Suffolk County and used to surf in Gilgo Beach. If you all have any questions for Alexis, I'm going to turn off the comments for now because they're covering her pretty face, and we just want to we'll take questions from the questions section. All right, let's give sort of everybody an idea of this whole saga and this terrible story about these murders. Can you just fill us in, Alexis, on what happened between 1996 and 2010?
Sure. So between 1996 and 2010, a killer or many killers, we're not exactly sure yet, used a stretch of highway on the South Shore of Long Island essentially as a dumping ground. And body parts and whole bodies were found along the stretch of beach in 2010 during the search for a woman who had gone missing from a nearby community. And this is where we've been led essentially. Finally we had an arrest after 13 years. These bodies were discovered 13 years ago, and finally there's an arrest in at least 4 of the cases associated with the Long Island serial killer series.
And let's talk about those 4 victims. They're Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, Maureen Brainerd Barnes. My daughter said, Mom, please mention their names. I think that's incredibly important. They tell us about these women because there are similarities among this particular set of victims.
Correct. So these women were all sort of forced into sex work under various circumstances. And beyond that, though, they were mothers, daughters, sisters. They had really full lives beyond just what they were doing when they were put in touch with allegedly the suspect. And beyond that, they all had physical similarities as well. They were all very petite. They were all in their mid to early 20s, and they were all connecting with clients over websites like Craigslist and various sites such as that.
And so finally, there was a huge gap, and we'll talk about in the investigation. We'll talk about that in a moment. But tell us about this man who was arrested for the murders of Melissa, Megan, and Amber. And I understand that he's a prime suspect in the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. His name is Rex Heuermann, and he doesn't seem to fit the description of somebody who would be capable of such brutal, grisly murders. Tell us about this individual, Alexis.
Sure. So Rex Heuermann is a 59-year-old architect from Massapequa Park, which is actually in Nassau County, and these murders were uncovered in Suffolk County. He had an office in Midtown Manhattan. He'd been working in the field for, 25 plus years. And what really surprised everybody was that he was married. He'd had a wife for about 27 years. He has a daughter and then a stepson as well. He lives in the same house that he grew up in Massapequa Park, and family still lived with him. So he certainly doesn't fit the mold when you think of, possible serial killers. You don't expect them to be essentially a family man, and it turns out he is.
Or a perfect, somebody, I guess you can't make generalizations because you think about Ted Bundy and people like that, but this guy, had his own architecture firm.
Right.
I thought it was interesting, Alexis. I've been reading about him. He hired mostly small, petite, sort of all-American young women to work at his firm. He was an avid hunter. He talked about hunting for bears and gutting, I guess, his kills. He also owned a shitload of guns, it
Yes.
sounds like. So he sounds like he was kind of a strange guy because he talked a lot and kind of liked to shock his colleagues. What else can you tell us about him? And do you think, there are, I guess, 11 murders or bodies in all that have been found on this stretch that were all considered part of the Long Island serial killer case. So, what can you tell us about the other victims?
Yeah, so there are a lot of differences between the Gilgo Four, which are the four women we talked about in the beginning, and the other victims. First of all, the other ones all happened earlier, like you said, between 1996 and around 2003. So they happened much earlier, and in those cases, there was either dismemberment or the victimology deviates completely. We know that there are some racially ambiguous victims that have yet to be identified from that stretch. We're talking about possibly somebody who is trans, and we're talking about a toddler who was also found. So the victimology deviates quite a lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's not involved. And I think the police know more about that than what is publicly available, because we saw, at least in the case they built against Rex Heuermann, they had eyes on him and they had identified him as a suspect 16 months prior to his arrest. And they kept that very close to their vest. So it's possible they know more already, and that's just not publicly available. And in terms of the first part of your question about, people who work for him are saying these things, like I've interviewed several people who did contract work for him or worked with him in other capacities. And they said that he always brought up the facts. He always brought up the Long Island serial killer case in so many of his encounters, almost as if, he has this like, I gotcha idea that he gets off on, talking about something that he allegedly had a hand in to people who have no idea, that stimulates him in some way.
Yeah,
And he's
it's
also
like
shared other
people.
little.
Yeah, I was going to say, Alexis, it's like people who return to the scene of the crime.
Well, and he made taunting calls to the sister of one of the Gilgo Four victims. And he said, allegedly, I drive by, I'm watching them decompose. He used much more crass language, but, Gilgo Beach is about 20 minutes from his house or less. So that is what he's doing. He was collecting information on all the family members of the victims. And these are a form of metaphysical trophies. They're not physical, but visiting the bodies, taunting and studying the family members, he's that information is something that he enjoys.
There was also some similarities about the manner in which these four women were murdered and differing from the other cases, and that, well, why don't you explain why there were similarities in these murders and why it seems to point to Rex Heuermann as a Heuermann, as a suspect.
Yeah, so in the Gilgo 4 cases, I think the official manner is homicidal violence. That's what they've been saying at the press conferences. But asphyxia is what they've been saying since the bodies were discovered. So I think there's some combination of the two. But we see in the other cases associated with the Long Island serial killer case, we've seen blunt force trauma. One of the victims had, they believe stab wounds, and some were just skeletal remains where it's difficult to tell exactly what happened. But the dismemberment would be one of the big things that differ the other victims from the Gilgo 4. Now, in terms of how the Gilgo 4 were left on the side of the road, they were wrapped in, it was described as burlap, but now we're finding that it's called like duck blind. It's a type of sort of burlap material that's used for duck hunting. And we know that Rex Heuermann is an avid hunter. And beyond that, we've learned since his arrest that the four victims were either bound with belts or tape. And the belt that was found with Maureen Brainerd Barnes had the initials WH on it. And that was something that was released 2 years ago, a piece of evidence that Suffolk County released, hoping that people would come forward with information about a possible suspect. And now with those initials, we've identified those initials to be Rex Heuermann's grandfather, whose name is William Heuermann. He also has an uncle named William Heuermann, who was the junior of the grandfather. So a lot of this looks and seems to tie back to Rex. And beyond that, they found female hairs with the 4 victims that have matched back to Rex Heuermann's wife.
DNA.
Yeah.
DNA, they found, right, DNA that was Rex Heuermann's DNA because they took bottles, I read, from his garbage. And meanwhile, his wife has filed for divorce. I read that he allegedly committed one of these murders in his home. He had a basement that was made of concrete that was, some have said soundproof, but I don't know. Can you shed any light on this basement situation?
Yeah, so they haven't said officially whether or not they believe the murders occurred in the house. However, if you read the bail application document, which lays out all the evidence, the cell phone evidence they have, they noted several times that the cell phones were going back to this house. The victim's cell phones were going back to this house as well. So you can deduce based on that, that that's where they're going with this. And in terms of the soundproof room, they're also keeping the purpose of this room kind of close to the vest. We've heard that it was a gun vault. He had, 279 guns that he kept in there. And at a press conference yesterday, they refused to answer exactly what other items were found in that concrete room underneath the house. Reporters asked if there was a mattress, and they just were responding with, several items were found. We're not really going to elaborate at this time. So, but it's a very mysterious, chilling possibility that that room was used for other things than a gun vault.
And apparently the wife had no idea what was going on. The whole situation sounds very strange with the wife. I know they have a special needs son. They have a daughter. She was listed as an employee of his architecture firm. The house, they were apparently quite isolated. They didn't really mingle with neighbors, and the house was very unkempt. So I don't know why. I just think that was interesting information I read.
Yeah, and my heart breaks for his family. According to the police, Rex's wife was out of town for the 4 alleged murders they suspect him of committing. So I do believe she really had no idea. And there's so much dysfunction that goes on in a house with a sociopath, a psychopath. So we can't even imagine what the 20-something years they've been married was like for her, and what kind of agency she had in that relationship or in that household. And I reserve all judgments, because you just don't know. If this man's capable of murder, he's certainly capable of abuse. He's certainly capable of emotional manipulation, gaslighting. So my heart breaks for her, and her filing for divorce is all I need to know. She's not supporting him through this. She's devastated, mortified, and she has a long road ahead of her. So I really feel for her.
I'm going to go to questions in a moment, but I haven't been able to look at them yet, everyone. But your podcast is called Unraveled, Alexis. And by the way, we're talking to Alexis Linkletter about the Gilgo Beach murders and the fact that this man named Rex Heuermann was arrested just a couple of days ago. Was it yesterday or the day before?
It was, last week, Friday.
Friday. And trying to understand this case, which is really upsetting, but also fascinating in the way that the Suffolk County Police didn't really handle this case very well. This is a bit tough to follow, but I think I understand it. Let's start with James Burke. He was named chief of police in 2011, right when interest in these murders was really ramping up. So tell us a little bit about James Burke and really your experience with him through your friend Chris Loeb.
Right. So I went to high school with Chris Loeb, and back in about 2013 or so, we got back in touch, and he told me that he was in jail because he was struggling with heroin addiction at the time, and he had resorted to breaking into vehicles to steal things from inside of them to sort of feed his addiction and support his addiction. And in 2012, he did that. He robbed a car. It was an SUV. And from inside this SUV, he pulled out a duffel bag and he got home with it. And he realized, look, this is a duffel bag that belongs to a police officer. And inside of it, there were things like evidence bags and other paraphernalia you'd expect a police officer to have. But there was also sex toys and hardcore pornography.
And snuff films, right?
Chris alleges that there was a snuff film in there. But what happened is that James Burke, who was the chief of police, showed up at Chris Loeb's house with officers. They beat Chris up and the bag disappeared. So it's never been officially documented in terms of what was in this bag. And then Chris was basically thrown into jail and silenced. And it took years for the truth about what happened. You know, Chris was held in a cell and beaten, and his rights were violated. His civil rights were violated. And while all of this happened to Chris, you know, James Burke is also the head of the Long Island serial killer investigation, which would have been active for about 2 years at that point because the bodies were discovered in 2010 and this happened in 2012. So I started exploring Chris's story and the political corruption involved in his case. And it was then that the ties to the Long Island serial killer case were made for me, where I realized, wow, James Burke is a deviant. And this deviant was overseeing the biggest serial killer investigation this county had ever seen. And nothing was getting done. And James Burke was also blocking the FBI from aiding in the investigation, not letting any outside jurisdictions aid in the investigation. And it made you wonder, why doesn't James Burke want help with this huge high profile case? And when we pulled on that thread, we found out why. It's like James Burke was hiring sex workers. He was going to sex parties. He was brutalizing sex workers at these parties. And it became a question of how he got into power in the first place, because back in the 90s, he got caught with a sex worker in his uniform, in his patrol car, and he got in trouble for that. And it was on his record, and there was an IAB investigation. So how did this man, first of all, get promoted to chief? And second of all, why would he be the right person to oversee an investigation into murdered sex workers? He's the worst person for this.
He also said something, Alexis, really kind of scary to your friend Chris Loeb. Can you tell us what Chris alleges James Burke said to him?
Yeah, Chris alleges that James Burke said that A, he was going to rape Chris's mother, and B, that he was going to kill him with a hot shot of heroin. And these are all things that are in the court documents. I
thought he had suggested something about sex workers too. Am I mistaken?
Chris alleges that he said something to the effect of, you know, I'll kill them. I'll kill you like I killed those women. Something to that effect. Unclear whether or not these statements are Chris's account. So as far as what he actually said, I'm sure it's somewhere close to that. The threats wouldn't surprise me at all.
Meanwhile, James Burke was eventually sent to prison for what?
So he was prosecuted for the civil rights violations perpetrated against Chris. And not only was James Burke convicted and sentenced to federal jail time, but so was the district attorney of Suffolk County at that time, who had a decades-long relationship with James Burke. So the two of them conspired together to cover up Chris's beating. And the Long Island serial killer case was going on in the background of all of this.
But basically, from what I've read and from what you've said, Alexis, they kind of let the case they weren't really paying attention to the case. They weren't really focused on it. It wasn't a priority for this James Burke when he was chief of police. The roommate of one of the victims claims that he gave a description of this Rex Heuermann, sorry, I have a hard time with his name, and also his truck, which was an Avalanche. And he said that they had that information, but they never really acted on it. So what does that all suggest to you, Alexis?
Right. So when this arrest of Rex Heuermann came about, everybody was expecting that some new earth-shattering evidence had been uncovered, which would have led to this very quick arrest, frankly, once the new task force was assembled. But now we're learning that this is all evidence that the Suffolk County Police Department had all along, beginning back in 2010, as soon as the bodies were discovered. So that creates a lot of questions. Why, if they had this evidence, if they had this description, a specific description of a first-generation Chevy Avalanche, if they had a very specific description of the owner of this Avalanche, and if this perpetrator had an incident with one of the victims the day before she went missing, why did no one act on that? Why did it take 13 years for anyone to pursue that? Because that would end up being the linchpin in Rex Heuermann's arrest. So that leads us to believe that the case was neglected or deliberately derailed. And this is because James Burke, at the time, didn't want the FBI to find out that he was going to sex parties in the same neighborhood where these bodies were being found and purchasing the services of sex workers. Like, he did not want to be found out about that. And he thought bearing his indiscretions were more important than solving the murders and giving closure to the victims' families.
So you say indiscretions. Do you think it was anything more serious than that, as far as you know? Is he considered any kind of person of interest in some of these other incidents?
It depends on who you ask. You know, Suffolk County is such an interesting place, and the level of corruption just gives people so much pause about what they can believe. You know, beyond the sex workers engaging in, you know, hiring sex workers, we know that he was doing cocaine at these parties. We know that he was violent with a number of them. I've interviewed them. I believe them. So if he's capable of those things, what would be to stop him? I've heard rumors about other activities that I don't want to repeat that include much more violence than what's been reported. So I think, sure, he's capable of extreme violence. Is he an official suspect? I would say no. But is he the reason that the case wasn't solved in 2010? I'd say probably.
Does he have any relationship at all with Rex Heuermann?
That is something that everybody, investigators, web sleuths, investigative journalists, that's what everybody is trying to figure out. Rex Heuermann lived in a neighboring county. There's no obvious ties to the police department, but, you know, the beach where his dumping ground allegedly is in Suffolk County. So he obviously has some connection to this area that is yet to be seen.
Sorry, so I was looking at the questions, but I think we've asked those already. So is there any suggestion that Rex Heuermann might not have acted alone? Are police looking into that? You know, regardless of what James Burke's situation is?
I think the police are keeping a very open mind. The new people in charge, the police commissioner, Rodney Harrison, the DA, Ray Tierney, they've proven to be extremely competent. I think as far as acting alone, whether like he had a partner, I don't know how two people can keep a secret this vast. It's certainly possible, but there's a chance there's another serial killer, in that these other victims, the other 6, are not connected to Rex. And that's something that we'll just have to see. We don't know what evidence the police have in those 6 cases. So as far as there being like a cabal or like a group of people, I think that possibility keeps being brought up just because of the corruption, because of what is the likelihood that Rex Heuermann is involved in this case, and a corrupt police officer who allegedly loves snuff films. And, you know, there's so much overlap that it really makes your head spin, and it makes you wonder whether people were working together. I see why that speculation is occurring.
Meanwhile, for the other victims, do police believe that they have the same, that the same person committed those murders, or is it just impossible to say? As you said, there was a toddler, there was a potential trans person, but do they all, the remaining unsolved cases, do they have enough similarities, Alexis, that police believe that one person was responsible for all those deaths?
So of the 6 that occurred before the Gilgo 4, which are the remaining cases associated with the Long Island serial killer series, the 2 latest, so that would be Valerie Mack, who went missing in 2000, and Jessica Taylor, who went missing in 2003, 2004. They are definitely connected. Their torsos were both found in Manorville, and their identifying body parts were found on Gilgo Beach. They're both sex workers. There's little doubt that that is the same killer, right? There's so much in common between the 2 of those that it would be very difficult for them to be separated.
But they don't believe Rex Heuermann was responsible for those.
They may, and maybe we just don't know. We know he's a hunter. Manorville is a place known for deer hunting. Maybe his MO changed. Those bodies were all, those torsos were found, but the body parts on Gilgo Beach were not. So maybe he changes his MO. I mean, I'm not ruling anything out. It's possible Rex is responsible for all of them. His age does not dispute that possibility. But I think the police know more than us, and they have a way better idea as to whether it's possible Rex committed those crimes or not.
You talked about 2 additional murders, but what about the other? I thought there were 11 in all, Alexis. So we're talking about the 4 that Heuermann is believed to have been involved with. And then we're talking about the 2 additional sex workers. So what about are there 5 more or?
So it gets a little tricky. So the 4 others would be Fire Island Jane Doe, Gilgo Beach Doe, which would be the trans victim, the baby, toddler, and Peaches. And Peaches has a peach-shaped tattoo, and then the toddler is her daughter. So that's the 10. Now, the 11th victim is where it gets a little tricky. Her name is Shannon Gilbert, and she was a sex worker who was working in a town called Oak Beach, and she ran from the home screaming, ran from the home of a client screaming, and she disappeared. And it was the massive search effort for her which led to the discovery of the bodies on Gilgo Beach. They found a body and they're like, this must be Shannon Gilbert. And it wasn't. And they found another and another. So the police have said of Shannon Gilbert that she was not a murder victim, that she in fact died of misadventure. They speculate that she was suffering from a mental illness and drowned in a ditch in these reeds. This is a waterfront community. That's what the police say. But many believe, including the family attorney, John Ray, that she was in fact murdered. And I would say that it's a 50-50 split on what people believe, whether she's a victim or not. But for example, if you look at the Gilgo News website, which is a Suffolk County website dedicated to this case, she's not listed as a victim on there.
Interesting. Well, obviously, I mean, it sounds like it's finally being run by people who are very competent, the investigation, because they reopened it, I guess, in January. And as you said, there's no great new evidence. They just went back and they have been able to make this determination, which is pretty damn scary when you consider the fact that this guy was running around a free man after, it seems, apparently involved in these really grisly, brutal murders. So that doesn't seem great. But what are you hoping to uncover in the next few days about this case, Alexis, or the next week or so?
Oh, in the next week, I just think I'm on the edge of my seat. They're releasing information in bits and pieces. We know that they wrapped up the search of Rex Heuermann's house. They're concluding that they found no additional human remains in the home. And that was something I was really keeping an eye on to see whether or not he would be brazen enough to have something like that in his house. But I think we're just trying to learn more. I want to know about his childhood. He was in his childhood home. People want to understand the psychology. They want to know how he allegedly became a serial killer, right? We want to know if there are more victims in other states. They're searching property he owns in South Carolina, which is where they found the Chevy Avalanche. They're searching and looking at him for cases possibly in Las Vegas, where he owns a timeshare with his wife. They're looking at him for potentially having a connection to 4 murdered sex workers in Atlantic City. I just think I'm really hungry for anything, but I learned that they can't put his DNA in a CODIS database until after he's convicted. based on New York state law, which I think is such a shame, because there could be people all over the country with murdered loved ones waiting for answers. And this case is going to be massive. It could take years to adjudicate. So I think that's a shame.
Well, I really appreciate you hopping on this Instagram Live, Alexis, to help explain it. Let me just check out the questions real quickly. I know that I think we've covered. It said, what happened to two men in call with Shannon? Is that the call where she said somebody was trying to hurt us or hurt me?
Yeah, so Shannon Gilbert's 911 call was released many years after it occurred, I think just 2 years ago. And she can be heard saying, they're trying to kill me. Now, the people present at the scene were Joseph Brewer, who was her client that night, and her driver, and that was a man named Michael Pack. So according to the police, they were questioned and cleared. I don't know how they were questioned and cleared, or what
but
evidence.
Also, what's kind of interesting is she said they.
Right.
Right. And I've read different accounts. Some people say they say somebody, her call was somebody's trying to kill me, and others say they are trying to kill me.
Yeah. Well, she may have said both. I don't recall off the top of my head. The call is about 24 minutes long, but she definitely sounds distressed. And you can understand why people speculate that she was murdered and that there is some sort of cover-up going on. Her remains were found last, even though the whole search effort was for her. And she was found a stone's throw from the house where she vanished from, in the same community. It was perplexing. All of that was perplexing. And another perplexing thing was that right after Shannon's remains were found is when James Burke was installed as the police chief. So the timing was very suspicious. And it's why people suspect there's a bigger conspiracy going on.
Well, people can hear the whole story by listening to your podcast, right, Alexis, called Unraveled. And how long have you been covering this story?
So before Unraveled, we started shooting that show and that podcast. I had been working on this for 5 years, trying to get a platform for it, trying to get somebody to take it seriously. But at first, no, people think political corruption's boring. I was fascinated. I continue to be riveted because this isn't the only case in Suffolk County that has gone awry in such a strange, suspicious way. But yeah, I continue to be just baffled at where this case takes us. And it keeps getting more and more peculiar.
I hate to say it, Alexis, but probably the victims, because they didn't look like Lacey Peterson or whatever, or they, were sex workers that people don't seem to be as invested in finding the killer, sadly, in our society. So I think probably for both of those reasons, but you've done incredible work to expose all this corruption and to, I don't know, maybe your work helped inspire the new police chief and the people involved in the investigation to really focus their time and energies on this. And obviously, that was worth it because now they have, a potential suspect or I guess a suspect in their midst. When do you think the legal proceedings for this Rex Heuermann will happen?
Who's to say? I mean, they're testing all the evidence they pulled from the house, which they said will take a long time. The discovery in this case is going to be overwhelming as far as his defense and trying to mount one. It could be years, and if they connect him to more cases, it's hard to know. I know they're making it a priority and they're going to have to brace themselves for a media spectacle because the attention of this case is massive. So it's hard to say. I would say years.
Years. Well, anyway, thanks again, Alexis. The podcast is Unraveled and really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Katie, a huge honor. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Let's stay in touch so you can continue to update us.
I would love that. Thank you so much again.
Okay. Thanks, Alexis.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.